Isabella Grant pulled the sheet over her father's face with both hands, walked straight to the stable, saddled her horse in the dark, and rode out of Red Creek before the undertaker arrived. She did not ride toward family. She had none left. She did not ride toward the law. The law was the problem. She rode toward the one man in the county Calvin Hayes had not yet touched, the one man no woman had visited in 11 years, and she intended to ask him to marry her before sunrise changed her mind. If this story already has its hand around your heart, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that bell so you never miss what comes next, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now stay with me, because what happens at that gate will change everything. Ethan Carter heard the horse before he saw it. He was at the north fence in the gray pre-dawn replacing wire by lantern light when the hoofbeats came up the long road from the south. Not a trot, not a casual ride, something between urgency and controlled panic, the rhythm of a person moving fast because stopping would mean thinking, and thinking was not something they could afford right now. He set down the pliers and turned. The horse was dark, a bay mare lathered at the neck from hard riding. The woman on its back sat straight as a fence post. Despite the speed, one hand on the reins, the other pressed flat against her thigh, like she was holding something down, something internal. She pulled up at his gate, hard enough that the mare snorted and sidled. Ethan did not move toward her. He had learned in 11 years of solitude that a person arriving like that needed a moment before they needed anything else. She took it. One breath. Two. Then she looked directly at him, and he recognized her. Isabella Grant, Robert Grant's daughter. The woman who ran the books at the largest dry goods operation in 3 counties, while her father's hands shook too badly to hold a pen. He had seen her in town perhaps a dozen times, had never spoken to her, had noticed the way a man notices things he has decided are not his concern, that she carried herself like someone braced for impact at all times. She was braced now. "Mr. Carter?" Her voice came out level. It cost her something to make it level. He could see that in the set of her jaw. "My father died an hour ago." He pulled off his work gloves, said nothing. "Calvin Hayes sent a man to inventory the back stockroom before my father's body was cold." Her hands tightened on the reins. "Not tomorrow, not next week, tonight. While I was still in the room with him." Something moved through Ethan's chest. Not surprise. Fury. Slow and quiet, the way a fire catches in dry grass, small at first, then everywhere. "I need a husband," she said. "I need one before Hayes files the seizure paperwork, which his man told my neighbor he intends to do by Thursday. Under county statute, a woman cannot hold a commercial license without a male guardian or spouse of legal standing." She held his gaze without flinching. "I have reviewed every option available to me. You are the only man in this county who is solvent, uncorrupted, and not already in Hayes's ledger." A pause that had iron in it. "I am asking you to marry me, Mr. Carter. And I am asking you now." The lantern swung slightly between them in the pre-dawn wind. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Really looked past the composure, past the straight back, and the controlled voice down to the thing underneath all of it. The thing she was not going to show him unless he looked for it himself. She was holding herself together with both hands. Had been probably for hours, maybe longer. "Get down," he said. She blinked. "I beg your pardon. Get down from the horse. Come inside." He picked up his lantern and turned toward the house. "You're going to tell me everything. Then I'm going to give you my answer." A beat of silence behind him. Then he heard the creak of the saddle as she dismounted. The house was plain, in the way that spoke of a man who had stopped trying to make a place feel like more than it was. A table, 4 chairs, a cast-iron stove, with a crack along its left side that had been repaired twice and held. A shelf of books along the far wall, more volumes than most ranch houses carried, and organized their spines worn in the way of books actually read. Ledgers stacked at precise angles on the side table. No photographs anywhere. No softness of any kind. Isabella took it in without comment and sat across from him at the table. He put the coffee on and sat down and said, "Start from the beginning. Don't leave anything out." She reached into her saddlebag and placed 3 things on the table between them: a leather ledger, a folded letter with a broken county seal, and a small glass jar empty that she set precisely in the center without explanation. Then she began. She talked for nearly 2 hours. No tears, no dramatics. Just facts delivered in the flat, organized cadence of a woman who had been turning this information over in her mind long before this morning, sorting it, sequencing it, preparing it for exactly this moment. Dates, amounts, names. The structure of what Hayes had been doing, laid out with a precision that would have impressed a lawyer. Hayes had been running a quiet extortion operation across Red Creek for at least 4 years. He used the county permit system as his instrument, finding technical violations or inventing them, then offering to make those violations disappear in exchange for ongoing payments. The trap was elegant in its cruelty: pay him and stay silent and stay safe, or refuse and face formal charges that by the time they were filed carried enough manufactured evidence to stick. He kept his own records of the payments records that implicated the payers as participants in fraud rather than victims of extortion. It meant that even the people who wanted to speak couldn't. They were as trapped by their silence as by their fear. "Pierce is backed against his water rights," she said, one finger moving down a column of her father's handwriting. The Hollins deed carries a surveying discrepancy that Hayes either found or introduced, no way to know which now. Voss signed over 15 acres 8 months ago just to keep his family in their home. She looked up. "My father paid Hayes $430 over 3 years. He wrote down every payment, every conversation, every threat. He kept it all in a shorthand he taught me when I was 12. Ethan turned the ledger toward him. The handwriting was dense and abbreviated, compressed into a code that meant nothing to his eyes. "You can read all of it. Every word. Why didn't your father use it if he had proof?" "He was afraid." She said it without judgment. Hayes told him directly once, only once, and he never needed to say it again. That proof in the hands of a dead man is just paper. She pressed her lips together briefly. "My father believed him." "And you don't." "I believe," she said carefully, "that proof in the hands of a living woman who knows how to use it is something else entirely." Ethan sat back in his chair. He looked at the ledger. At the broken sealed letter, a county filing notice, he could see now a preliminary seizure document with the Grant Mercantile's address already printed on it. At the woman across from him, who had buried her father 2 hours ago and ridden through darkness to a stranger's gate, and was sitting here now with dry eyes and a plan. "The jar," he said. "Why'd you bring it?" She glanced at it. Something shifted in her expression, the first crack in the surface, small and quickly controlled. "My mother had a belief that any real agreement needs to be made over something physical, something you can hold." A short pause. "She put a jar on the table every time my father signed a new contract, said it held the intention of the thing." She looked back at him. "I know it sounds like foolishness." "It doesn't," he said. He moved the jar so it sat exactly between them. "I'll marry you," he said. Her breath caught, barely, almost inaudible, but he heard it. "But not on your terms alone," he continued. "If we do this, we do it as equal partners. Every piece of information you have, you share with me as you have it. Not after you've decided what I need to know. Not after you've made a decision alone that affects us both. Everything." He met her eyes and held them. "I've been alone on this land for 11 years, Miss Grant. I know how to make decisions by myself. I am not interested in a marriage where we live 3 feet apart and still make decisions by ourselves. That's not partnership. That's just loneliness with paperwork." The silence between them was different now. It had weight, but not the heavy kind. The kind that comes just before something settles. "Yes," she said. Quiet. Certain. "I can do that." "Then we have an agreement." He reached across and pushed the jar 1 inch toward the center of the table. She looked at it, then placed 2 fingers on its rim and moved it back equal distance between them. The stove ticked in the silence. Outside, the sky was beginning to change color at its eastern edge. Dawn coming whether either of them was ready for it. "I need to bury him this afternoon," she said. She had begun gathering her things quietly, efficiently, the way she did everything. The minister is arranged. The gravesite is chosen. Her hands stilled for just a moment over the ledger. He died alone in that back room. I was organizing the front shelves. I didn't know until the store went quiet. She did not look up. He didn't call out. I've been trying to decide if that means he didn't want to worry me or if it happened too fast. A breath. I suppose it doesn't matter now. Ethan did not offer comfort. There were no words for this that wouldn't be an insult to the weight of it. Instead, he said, "I'll be there this afternoon, and tomorrow morning I ride in with you to the store. I want to see every record, every permit filing everything Hayes has ever put his name to in connection with your father's property." She looked up then, and for just one moment, one unguarded second, before she closed it back down, something moved across her face. Not gratitude exactly. More like the expression of a person who has been carrying something enormous alone for so long that the offer of another pair of hands nearly undoes them entirely. Then it was gone, and she was composed again. "Thank you," she said. Simply, without elaboration. She stood, shouldered her saddlebag, and walked to the door, paused with her hand on the frame. "Mr. Carter." She did not turn. "Why did you say yes?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because Hayes already wrote your father off," he said. "And your father paid him and kept his mouth shut and died in a back room alone. And I reckon that's exactly what Hayes is counting on from everyone else in this county." He paused. "I'm tired of giving men like that what they're counting on." She stood there a moment longer. Then she walked out, untied the mare mounted clean and smooth, and rode back toward Red Creek without looking back. Ethan sat at the table and looked at the glass jar between his hands. Turned it once. Set it down. He had told her part of the truth. The practical part. The righteous part. The part that was easy to say out loud. He had not told her the other part. The part he wasn't ready to examine yet. The part that had happened in the space of 2 hours across his kitchen table, while a woman who refused to collapse showed him what it looked like when a person refused to be broken. He was not ready to name that. Not yet. He picked up the jar and set it on the shelf beside the books. Carefully. Like it meant something. Because it did. In his office at the far end of Red Creek's main street, Calvin Hayes was already at his desk when the sun came up. His man had returned from the Grant store at midnight with a full inventory of the back stockroom, and one additional piece of information: Isabella Grant's horse had not been in the stable when he arrived, and it had not returned by the time he left. Hayes set down his coffee cup. "Where'd she ride to?" he asked. "Couldn't say for certain, sir." The deputy shifted his weight. "But the South Road, headed out past the Aldridge feed property." Hayes was quiet for a moment. The South Road ran 2 directions past Aldridge's, toward the Miller place, which was already under his thumb and no threat to him, or toward the long, dry stretch of land that ran 11 years uncontested under one name. He pulled a fresh sheet of paper from his drawer, wrote 2 words at the top. Ethan Carter, drew a single slow line beneath it, and began to think about how a man with no enemies and no debts suddenly became a man with both. Robert Grant went into the ground on a Tuesday afternoon with 11 people standing at the grave. Ethan counted them without meaning to. It was the kind of thing a man noticed when he had spent too long paying attention to numbers instead of people. 11 mourners for a man who had run the largest dry goods store in 3 counties for 22 years. 11 people, and half of them were there out of obligation rather than grief. He could see it in the way they stood slightly angled toward the road, like they were already calculating how quickly they could leave without being noticed. Isabella stood at the head of the grave and did not cry. She received condolences with 2 hands and a steady voice and said thank you to each person in turn, and not one of them stayed longer than 3 minutes. Ethan watched them go one by one back toward town, back toward their own fears and their own silences. And he understood something he had suspected since that morning. The people of Red Creek were not cold. They were afraid. There was a difference, even if it didn't feel like one, to the person standing alone at the grave. He was the last one there. He had stayed back during the condolences. It wasn't his place yet, and he knew it, but when the others were gone, and the minister had packed his Bible and gone, Ethan walked up and stood beside her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. "He would have liked fewer people," she said finally. "He was a private man." "Then it was the right funeral," Ethan said. Something close to a smile moved across her face, gone before it fully arrived. "We should go to the courthouse tomorrow, first thing before Hayes knows what we're doing. I know a circuit judge," he said. "Judge Edmund Halloran. He rode this territory for 15 years before he retired to Cutter's Bend. He's honest. Was honest then at least, and men like that don't usually change direction." He paused. "He'd know if there's a legal path here that doesn't run through Hayes." She turned to look at him. "You'd contact him." "Already sent a rider this morning." The almost smile came back. This time it stayed a half-second longer. "You move fast for a man who's been standing still for 11 years. "I move fast," he said, "when the reason is good enough." She looked back at the grave. "We should also go to the store tonight. I want to show you the permit files before Hayes makes another move. He won't wait long." "After supper," he said. "I'll ride in." She nodded. And then, because there was nothing left to say and everything left to do, they walked away from Robert Grant's grave in opposite directions, her toward town, him toward the South Road, and the afternoon closed over the cemetery like it had never been disturbed. The Grant Mercantile after dark was a different animal than the one the town saw during business hours. With the front lamps out and the street quiet, it was just a building with too much weight in its walls, shelves of inventory that represented 22 years of a man's labor. All of it now sitting under a cloud that had a name and a badge and an office at the end of the main street. Isabella moved through the back room with a lantern and pulled records from 3 different locations. The visible files in the cabinet by the desk, a second set tucked inside a flour sack on the bottom shelf, and her father's hidden ledger from beneath the loose board she had mentioned. She laid them all on the work table and stepped back. "Everything Hayes ever touched is in one of these 3 places," she said. "The visible files are what he's seen. The flour sack is what my father kept separate, the real invoices, the real numbers, what the store actually earned versus what he reported to Hayes to justify the payment amounts. And the ledger," she touched its cover. "The ledger is everything my father witnessed and wrote down." Ethan picked up the visible files first. He was not a fast reader, but he was a precise one, and he went through the permit records page by page while Isabella stood across the table and watched him with her arms folded and her mind clearly moving 3 steps ahead of the room. He found the first irregularity on the 4th page. "This inspection report," he said, "March of last year. It says the store failed a structural assessment and was required to pay a remediation fee of $60. The building passed the same assessment 2 months earlier," she said. "I have that record in the flour sack." So Hayes issued a second inspection, found a violation that didn't exist in February, and charged $60 to make it go away. That's how it works. He never asks for a large amount at once, small enough that it feels cheaper to pay than to fight, large enough that it adds up to something significant over time. She pulled a page from the flour sack and slid it across to him. $60 in March, $40 in July, $90 in November. That one was a fire safety concern that mysteriously appeared the same week my father tried to expand the back storage room. Ethan set the pages side by side. The pattern was clear and deliberate and documented well enough that a competent lawyer could work with it. "How many other businesses in Red Creek does he do this to?" "At minimum 7 that I can confirm." She pulled the ledger open to a page near the middle. "My father had contact with all of them at various points. Pierce at the lumber operation, the Hollands, Voss, the widow Dietz who runs the boarding house, the mill on Cutter Creek, the Aldridge feed operation, though Aldridge pays in favors rather than cash, which is a different problem, and Martin Beale at the telegraph office." Ethan looked up sharply. "Beale Hayes controls the telegraph. Not formally, but Beale has a land dispute. Hayes has been sitting on for 2 years without resolution. As long as that dispute is unresolved, Beale owes Hayes a certain amount of cooperation." She met his eyes. which means any telegram you send from Red Creek goes through a man who has reason to share its contents. The implications of that settled over both of them. The writer I sent to Halloran, Ethan said. Was a writer, she said. Not a telegram, so that's safe. She paused. I noticed you sent a person and not a wire. I wondered if you already knew about Beale. I didn't, he said. I just don't trust telegraphs. Good instinct. He closed the permit files and looked at the full spread of documents on the table. It was a significant body of evidence, more than he had expected, more carefully kept than most men would have managed under that kind of sustained fear. Robert Grant had been methodical even while he was being broken. There was something both admirable and devastating about that. We need to make copies, Ethan said. Originals stay hidden. Copies go somewhere Hayes can't reach with Halloran if he's willing, or with a lawyer in the county seat. He looked at her. Can you write fast? Faster than you, she said, and picked up a pen without waiting to be asked. They worked for 2 hours. She copied, he organized, and neither of them spoke much because the work required attention, and they were both people who understood that some things required silence. At some point, she lit a second lantern. At some point, he moved around the table to check a reference, and ended up standing beside her rather than across from her, and neither of them moved back. It was close to midnight when she set down the pen and pressed her fingers against her eyes. When does it stop feeling like this? She said. He didn't pretend not to understand. The weight of it, the feeling that he's already won, that no matter what we put on paper, Hayes has the badge and the courthouse, and 11 years of this county's fear behind him. She lowered her hands. I know what the evidence says. I know what's right. But at midnight in a dead man's back room, it's hard to feel it. Ethan was quiet for the moment. Then, you know what Hayes is counting on. He's counting on exactly this. Midnight, exhaustion. The feeling that the mountain is too big. He picked up the copied pages and squared them against the table. He's been doing this long enough that he knows most people give up before dawn. Your father gave up. Not because he was weak, because he was alone. He set the pages down and looked at her directly. You're not alone now. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked away. First, not from discomfort, he thought, but from the same reflex that makes a person look away from something too bright. We should finish, she said. They finished. 3 days after Robert Grant's funeral, Ethan Carter and Isabella Grant were married in the parlor of the Red Creek minister with 2 witnesses, the minister's wife and old Thomas Aldridge, who had known both families for decades and kept his mouth mostly shut about most things, which made him the closest thing to neutral ground either of them had access to. The ceremony was brief, practical. Isabella wore the same gray wool she had worn to the funeral because it was her best, and there was no time and no reason to pretend otherwise. Ethan wore a clean shirt and his good boots, and said his words clearly and without hesitation. When it was done, Aldridge shook Ethan's hand and patted Isabella's arm and said, Your father would be proud, in a voice that cracked slightly on the last word. And Isabella thanked him and did not allow herself to respond to it until he was out the door. By noon, the marriage certificate was filed at the county seat. By 2 in the afternoon, Ethan's name was on the Grant Mercantile's operating license. By 4 o'clock, Calvin Hayes knew. Ethan was back at the ranch checking the water levels on the East Trough when he heard a horse come up the road, fast. He turned and saw Deputy Arlo Greer pulling up at the gate, Hayes' man young and nervous, and trying hard not to look it. Mr. Carter? Greer touched his hat brim. The gesture was automatic, like a habit he hadn't decided whether to keep. Sheriff Hayes sends his regards on your recent marriage. Tell him I appreciate it, Ethan said. Did not move toward the gate, did not invite anything further. Greer shifted in the saddle. He also wanted me to pass along that the county is doing a full assessment of all commercial properties currently undergoing ownership transitions. Standard procedure. He expects it won't be any trouble for a man of your standing. Ethan looked at him for a long moment. What kind of assessment? Financial records, operating history, tax compliance going back 5 years. A pause. He said to tell you the assessor would be by Thursday. Thursday. 2 days. Tell Sheriff Hayes, Ethan said slowly, that I look forward to cooperating fully with any legitimate county process. He held Greer's eyes. And tell him I said legitimate. Greer heard it. Something moved across his face, not quite guilt, but adjacent to it. He touched his hat again and turned his horse and rode back toward town without another word. Ethan watched him go. Then he went inside and wrote a fast note, folded it, and sent his own rider south toward Cutter's Bend before the sun moved another hour across the sky. That night, he told Isabella about the deputy's visit over the table in her father's store, where they had fallen into the habit of meeting after dark to review what each day had uncovered. She did not react the way he expected. She did not tighten or pale or reach for the ledger. She simply nodded once, like she had been anticipating this move and had already thought 3 steps past it. "He's testing us," she said. "He wants to see if we panic. He wants to see what we've got," Ethan said. "If we lawyer up before Thursday, he knows we have something to protect. If we cooperate fully, he gets access to your father's records." "He doesn't get access to anything," she said. "Because by Thursday, the originals are in a locked box in Judge Halloran's possession in Cutter's Bend." She looked at him. "Did Halloran respond?" "Ryder came back this afternoon. He'll meet us Saturday. He's already reviewing what I described in the letter." Ethan paused. He said, and I'm quoting him directly, "I have been waiting for someone in Red Creek to grow a spine for 3 years." Something flashed in her eyes. Satisfaction, sharp and clean. He knows. He knows something. Whether he knows enough is what Saturday will tell us. She stood and moved to the window, looked out at the dark main street of Red Creek at the lamplight from Hayes's office at the far end, always burning like the man never slept. "There are 6 other families in this town who have been paying him," she said. "If we go to Halloran alone, we might save the store. We might get Ethan cleared. But Hayes walks away. He regroups. He finds another county." "I know," Ethan said. "We need them to speak." She turned from the window. "We need Pierce and the Hollands and Dietz and all of them to put their names on paper and stand somewhere public and say what happened to them." "That's a different ask than saving one store." "Yes." She didn't flinch from it. "It is." He looked at her across the room. In the lamplight, with the evidence of everything her father had suffered stacked on the table between them, she looked tired for the first time since he had met her. Not broken, not wavering. Just tired in the way that honest people get tired when they realize the right thing is going to be harder than they prepared for. "I'll start with Pierce," he said. "He and I have an understanding about the water rights on the north boundary. He owes me a conversation. And I'll speak with Margaret Dietz," she said. "She's been running that boarding house alone since her husband passed. She understands what it means to hold something together by yourself." Ethan nodded. "We have until Saturday. After Halloran, we'll know what shape the legal ground looks like. Then we approach the others." She nodded, began gathering the copied documents for the locked box, careful, systematic, each page accounted for. He was almost at the door when she said quietly, without looking up, "Ethan." First time she had used his given name. He stopped. "Thank you," she said. "Not for the arrangement, for treating it like it matters." He stood there a moment. "It does matter," he said, and walked out into the dark street. Behind him, the lamp in Hayes's office burned on at the far end of town. Patient, certain of itself. The light of a man who had never yet miscalculated. But somewhere in a locked flour sack behind a false panel in the Grant Mercantile's back room, 3 years of careful, frightened, meticulous truth waited in a dead man's handwriting. And 2 people who had agreed to stop being alone were just beginning to understand what that meant. The cattle went missing on a Wednesday night. All 23 head from Ethan's east pasture. Gone without a sound, without a track that led anywhere useful, without a single witness. Just an empty field where his livelihood had been standing at sundown, and nothing but churned dirt by the time he walked the fence line at dawn. He stood at the broken gatepost and looked at the ground and felt something cold move through him, that had nothing to do with the morning air. This was not a warning. This was the opening move. Ethan did not ride to town to report the missing cattle. That was the first decision, and he made it standing at the broken gatepost in the gray morning light, with the cold knowledge that riding to Hayes' office to report a theft, orchestrated by Hayes' men, was exactly what Hayes wanted him to do. It would put him in that office. It would put him across a desk from a man who had been running this county for 4 years and knew every angle of every room he occupied. It would give Hayes a look at his face, his composure, his fear level. Ethan was not going to give him any of that for free. He walked back to the house, washed up, and sent a rider to Isabella before breakfast. She arrived in 40 minutes. He had coffee waiting. She sat down across from him, and he told her plainly. 23 head east pasture, the gatepost broken outward, not inward, which meant someone who knew how to make a forced entry look casual. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "He moved faster than Saturday. He moved the night after I told Greer we'd cooperate with the assessment," Ethan said. "He wanted to see if I'd panic and ride in to report it. And you didn't. And I didn't." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and was quiet for a moment, thinking. He had learned already in the short days of knowing her that her silences were not empty. They were working silences, the kind that produced something when they ended. "He'll file the report himself," she said. "That's the next move. He'll claim someone brought the cattle to his attention, an anonymous tip, a concerned citizen, and he'll have his deputy document the theft and open an investigation. And somewhere in that investigation, evidence will appear that points back to you." Ethan felt the shape of it settle into place. Frame me for stealing my own cattle. Frame you for cattle theft, full stop. The ownership becomes a detail that gets buried in paperwork. She looked at him. How many people know those cattle are yours specifically? Not just that you run cattle, but that those 23 head from the east pasture belong to Ethan Carter. He thought about it. Aldridge knew I bought 6 of them from his cousin last spring. Pierce saw me work the fence line on the east boundary in September. A few hands from the Miller place would know the general count. He paused. Not many people with specific knowledge. Hayes will manufacture specific knowledge, she said. A witness. Someone who will testify they saw you moving cattle in the wrong direction at the wrong time. She stood up and moved to the window, not looking at anything, just needing to move. We have to get to Halloran before Hayes files the report. If there's a theft charge on record before Halloran sees the evidence, it muddies everything. Hayes gets to reframe the entire situation. Suddenly, the man bringing corruption charges against the sheriff is also under investigation for felony theft. How long do we have? A day, maybe less. She turned back to him. Can your rider reach Cutter's Bend by nightfall? If he leaves within the hour, then we don't wait until Saturday. Ethan was already standing. I'll write to Halloran now. You need to go to Pierce this morning. Today, not tomorrow. If Hayes moves to arrest me before we have the other families on record, we lose the weight of numbers. She nodded. Her jaw was set in that way it got when she had made a decision and closed the door on doubt behind her. I'll go to Pierce, then the Hollands. I'll have Margaret Dietz by afternoon if I push. Be careful how you travel, he said. Don't take the main road. She looked at him for a half second with an expression that said she had already thought of that. Then she was out the door. Pierce ran his lumber operation from a property 2 miles north of the Carter Ranch on land that backed up against the creek Hayes had been quietly contesting for 18 months. He was a big man, broad through the shoulders, with the permanently cautious expression of someone who had learned that good news usually came with a condition attached. He opened his door and looked at Isabella standing on his porch without a word for a full 3 seconds. "Miss Grant," he said, then correcting himself, "Mrs. Carter." "I need 30 minutes of your time," she said. "And I need you to tell me the truth about what Calvin Hayes has done to this property." Pierce looked past her at the road, the reflex of a man who checked for witnesses before he said anything real. "You'd better come inside," he said. What came out over the next 30 minutes was everything her father's ledger had suggested, and more. Hayes had approached Pierce 2 years prior with documentation of a survey discrepancy along the creek boundary. A discrepancy Pierce had never heard of and could not verify, because the original survey records had Hayes told him been damaged in a courthouse filing error. The creek access was critical to the lumber operation. Without it, the mill couldn't function. Hayes had offered to resolve the discrepancy administratively to make the survey records right in exchange for a monthly arrangement. Pierce had paid, every month for 22 months. "I've got records," Pierce said. He said it like a man confessing something shameful. "I kept every receipt, every note I wrote down after every conversation. I didn't know if it would ever matter, but I kept them." He looked at his hands. "My wife told me to go to the law. I told her the law was the problem." "The law is still the problem," Isabella said, "but we're building something around it. Judge Edmund Halloran, out of Cutter's Bend. He's been made aware of the pattern. If you'll put your records in writing formal testimony, signed and dated, and add your name to what we're bringing to him, Hayes loses the ability to claim this is one complaint from one person with a grievance." Pierce was quiet for a long moment. "What happens to my water rights while this plays out?" "I can't promise you a timeline," she said. "I won't lie to you about that. But I can promise you that staying silent has a timeline too, and it ends with Hayes taking the creek entirely." She met his eyes. "You know that. You've known it for 2 years." He looked at her with the expression of a man who was tired in a way that went past the body. "My father built this mill," he said. "He cut every beam himself." "I know," she said quietly. "My father built his store the same way." The silence between them held the weight of two people who understood what it meant to watch something inherited become something threatened. "All right," Pierce said. "I'll write it down. I'll sign it." She was back on the road within the hour. The Hollands were harder. Frank Holland met her at the fence line of his property and did not invite her inside. He was a lean man with a tight mouth and the look of someone who had made a decision and was committed to the discomfort of it. "I heard about your father," he said. "I'm sorry for it." "Thank you," she said. "Frank, I know why you're here." His voice was not unkind. It was careful. "And I can't. You have the survey discrepancy on your deed. I have a family," he said. 3 children and a wife and a piece of land that is the only thing standing between us and nothing." His eyes were direct, not cruel, frightened in the specific way of a man who has calculated the cost of courage and found it too high. Hayes has already made it clear what happens to people who make noise. The Jennings family made noise. You know what happened to the Jennings family. She did. Everyone did. The Jennings had packed and left Red Creek 18 months ago, their property transferred to a county holding, under circumstances that were never fully explained and never formally challenged. "The Jennings were alone," she said. "You wouldn't be. You're 2 people," he said. "You and a rancher who just lost 23 head of cattle this morning. Forgive me, Mrs. Carter, but that doesn't read to me as strength." The information stopped her. He already knew about the cattle, which meant Hayes had already started talking, already begun shaping the story, before Ethan had even decided how to respond. She kept her voice even. "How do you know about the cattle?" Holland looked at her steadily. "Greer came by this morning. Said Hayes was opening an investigation into a theft ring operating in the South Range." A pause that had something uncomfortable in it. "He said your husband's east pasture was involved." Her stomach tightened. Not panic. Focus. Sharp and cold. "What exactly did Greer say about my husband's involvement?" Holland hesitated. Then, "He said Carter was a person of interest." There it was. Less than 12 hours since the cattle disappeared, and Hayes had already planted the seed. Person of interest. Not accused, not charged. Just the phrase left in the air, casual as a dropped match in dry grass, designed to smolder quietly until it caught. "Frank," she said. Her voice was very quiet now, the kind of quiet that carried. "If Hayes can do this to us, if he can move this fast against a man with clean records and 11 years of honest operation, what do you think he'll do to your deed the moment you stop being useful to him?" Holland said nothing. "You're not safe because you're cooperating," she said. "You're just not his target yet. There is a difference." She left him standing at the fence. She did not know if she had reached him. She did not have time to wait and find out. Antai. Margaret Dietz said yes before Isabella finished asking. The widow who ran the Red Creek boarding house was 61 years old and had the look of a woman who had survived enough that fear had become a familiar rather than a master. She poured tea, sat across from Isabella at her kitchen table, and listened to the entire situation without interrupting once. When it was done, she said, "I've been waiting for someone to come to this door for 2 years. You'll testify. I'll testify. I'll sign whatever needs signing, and I'll talk to Ruth Holland myself, if that's what it takes to get Frank off the fence." She set her cup down with a definitive click. "Calvin Hayes charged me $120 last year for a fire inspection that no other building on this street received. I have the receipt. I have the letter he sent beforehand. I have the note I wrote down the day after with everything he said to me verbatim, because my mother always told me to write down what men tell you when they think you're too old and too female to be a threat." Isabella felt something loosen slightly in her chest, the first breath in 2 days that didn't feel rationed. "Mrs. Dietz," she said, "your mother was a wise woman." "She survived 3 decades on the frontier," Margaret said. "Wisdom was a survival skill." Ethan was at the south fence mending the section nearest the road when 2 of Hayes' deputies rode up in the late afternoon. Not Greer this time. 2 men he recognized only by their badges, younger, less practiced at the nervous habit hat touch, which meant they had been sent precisely because they had less compunction about what they were being asked to do. "Ethan Carter," the first one said. Not a question. "You know who I am," Ethan said. He did not put down his tools. "Sheriff Hayes requests your presence at the office. Routine questions regarding a cattle theft reported in the South Range." "When was it reported?" "This morning." "By who?" The deputy's expression flickered. "Anonymous tip." Ethan looked at him for a long moment. "I'll come in tomorrow morning, with my lawyer." "Sheriff says today." "My lawyer is in Cutter's Bend," Ethan said. "I'll have him here by tomorrow morning." He turned back to the fence. "Tell Hayes I said I look forward to cooperating fully with any legitimate county process." The second time, he had used those exact words to Hayes's men. He said it deliberately. He wanted Hayes to hear the same phrase twice and understand that Ethan Carter was not improvising. The deputies exchanged a look, then they rode back toward town. Ethan set down the wire cutters and pressed both hands flat against the fence post and breathed. Once, twice. He had bought 1 day. Maybe. The rider reached Cutter's Bend by nightfall, as promised. Judge Edmund Halloran read Ethan's letter by lamplight, then read it again, then called for his horse. He arrived in Red Creek the following morning before Hayes's office opened. He was 67 years old, lean and weathered, with the kind of eyes that had seen enough courtrooms to recognize theater when it was being performed for his benefit. He rode directly to the Grant Mercantile, tied his horse at the post, walked in through the front door, and found Ethan and Isabella already there, the full spread of evidence laid out across the work table. He did not say hello. He looked at the table and said, "How long has he been running this?" "At minimum 4 years," Isabella said. "Possibly longer before my father started keeping records." Halloran pulled out a chair, sat down, and picked up the first page of the ledger copy. "Who else is documented here?" Pierce confirmed everything in his section this morning. Margaret Dietz has original documents. The Hollands are undecided. She paused. "And Hayes has already told this county that my husband is a person of interest in a cattle theft investigation." Halloran looked up from the page, looked at Ethan. "Your cattle, gone Wednesday night," Ethan said. "All 23 head." The judge was quiet for a moment. Something moved behind his eyes, not surprise exactly, but the expression of a man confirming something he had suspected. "He's accelerating," he said. "He knows something is moving against him." He set the page down. "This is no longer a county matter. This documentation, if it holds, and from what I'm seeing it holds, this is federal jurisdiction. Land fraud, extortion, abuse of office across multiple properties over multiple years." He folded his hands on the table. I need to contact the federal marshal's office in Austin. How long does that take? Ethan asked. Longer than we have if Hayes files charges against you today, Halloran said plainly, which is why we need to move this into a public forum before he does. He looked at Isabella. The families. Every name in this ledger that can be turned into a living witness. Can you get them in one place? I can try, she said. Don't try, Halloran said. Do it. Because once Hayes puts Ethan Carter's name on a formal theft charge, the story this county hears stops being about corruption and starts being about a rancher under investigation whose wife is making accusations. He's not just stealing cattle, Mrs. Carter. He's stealing the narrative. He looked between them. We need to steal it back before he files. The door of the mercantile opened. Frank Holland stood in the frame, hat in his hands. The look of a man who had spent the night making a decision and arrived at it the hard way. My wife reminded me, he said, that my father built that land for my children, not for Calvin Hayes. He looked at Isabella. Tell me where to sign. Outside, down at the far end of the main street, the door to Hayes's office opened. Hayes himself stepped out onto the boardwalk and stood looking toward the mercantile with the still assessing patience of a man who was very good at waiting and very certain of what was coming. He could not see what was happening inside that building. He did not yet know that the thing he had been trying to prevent for 4 years had quietly, steadily, irreversibly begun. Frank Holland had barely stepped through the door when Hayes moved. Not physically, not yet. But Ethan saw it from the mercantile window the way Hayes turned on the boardwalk and went back inside his office without the unhurried ease he usually performed for the street. That was a man who had just seen something that changed his calculation. He didn't know what was happening inside the Grant mercantile. But he knew something was happening, and Calvin Hayes had not maintained 4 years of control over this county by ignoring the things he couldn't see. He's going to move today, Ethan said. Halloran did not look up from the ledger. Then we move first. How? The judge set the page down and looked at the people in the room, Ethan, Isabella, Frank Holland still standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands. Is there a place in this town where people gather that isn't Hayes' office or Hayes' courthouse? The mercantile itself, Isabella said immediately. My father held community meetings here twice a year. The back room holds 30 people if they're willing to stand. Then that's where we do this. Halloran stood. He had the unhurried authority of a man who had presided over enough chaos to know that urgency and panic were not the same thing. Mrs. Carter, I need every person in that ledger who is willing to speak in this building within 2 hours. Mr. Holland, I need you to start walking. Mr. Carter. He looked at Ethan directly. Stay visible. Don't go anywhere. Hayes can claim you are hiding. If he sends a deputy, you're here, you're cooperative, and you're doing it in front of witnesses. And you? Ethan asked. Halloran picked up his coat. I'm going to pay a courtesy call on the sheriff, he said. Old judges and old sheriffs understand each other. I want him looking at me while your wife is moving behind him. Isabella was already reaching for her coat. Pierce first. He said yes yesterday, and he'll bring his foreman. Dietz will come without asking twice. The mill operator on Cutter Creek. Harlan Bowes, Ethan said. He owes me a debt from 2 winters ago. I'll send a rider. Do it now, Halloran said. He buttoned his coat, looked around the room one final time with the eyes of a man cataloging what he had to work with. 4 years this man has been bleeding this county dry. He did it because he was certain that frightened people stay frightened. He picked up his hat. Let's show him what happens when they stop. He walked out the front door of the mercantile and turned toward the sheriff's office without breaking stride. Ethan watched him go. Then he turned to Isabella. 2 hours. 1.5, she said, and walked out the back. Halloran entered Hayes' office the way he entered every room that required him to establish territory immediately, without knocking, without announcing himself, simply opening the door and stepping through it, as though the threshold had already conceded the point. Hayes was at his desk. He looked up. His expression moved through surprise recognition and careful neutrality in the space of 2 seconds. Fast, but not fast enough. Judge Halloran. He stood, extended his hand. "I didn't know you were in Red Creek." "Rode in this morning," Halloran said, shaking the hand and releasing it, and sitting down in the chair across the desk without being invited to. "Thought I'd stop in. I still have friends in this county even in retirement." Hayes sat back down slowly. "What brings you out this way?" "Old business," Halloran said pleasantly. "I've been reviewing some property records from my circuit years. Discrepancies I never fully resolved. You know how it is, a retired man with too much time and too tidy a conscience." He folded his hands in his lap. "I understand you've been managing quite a few property disputes since you took office." "Part of the job," Hayes said. His voice was even, professional. But his right hand, Halloran noticed, had moved to the edge of the desk and stayed there. "County grows disputes multiply." Halloran nodded slowly, looking at nothing in particular. "I also understand you've opened an investigation into Ethan Carter. Cattle theft. Ongoing matter. I can't discuss specifics." "Of course not." Halloran smiled the smile of a man who had heard that phrase from 100 different mouths in 100 different courtrooms. "Well, I won't keep you. Just wanted to pay my respects." He stood, unhurried. "I'll be in town through the end of the week, I expect. You know how it is, once you start pulling at old threads." He walked out. Behind him, he heard the quiet, controlled sound of a man picking up a pen and writing something with controlled fury. Good. Let him write. Let him send for his deputy. Let him spend the next 20 minutes responding to Halloran instead of watching what was happening 2 blocks away. 20 minutes was all Isabella needed. She got Pierce in 12. He arrived at the back entrance of the Mercantile with his foreman and a locked document case and the expression of a man who had made his peace with a hard decision and was now simply executing it. He shook Ethan's hand, nodded at Holland, and set the case on the work table without preamble. "Everything's in there," he said. 2 years of payments, the correspondence, the survey documentation Hayes gave me, which I had independently assessed 6 months ago by a surveyor out of San Antonio who confirmed it was falsified. He looked at Ethan. "I didn't tell anyone, because I didn't know what to do with it alone." "You're not alone now," Ethan said. Margaret Dietz arrived 4 minutes later with Ruth Holland, Frank's wife, who had apparently been waiting for this moment longer than her husband had realized, because she walked in with her own envelope of documents and set it on the table beside Pierce's case, with the quiet authority of a woman who had been organized for this contingency for quite some time. Frank Holland looked at his wife. "How long have you had those?" 14 months, Ruth said. She did not look apologetic. "I told you we needed to do something. You told me to be patient." Holland absorbed this with the expression of a man recalibrating his understanding of his own household. Harlan Bowes from the Cutter Creek Mill arrived on foot slightly out of breath with a younger man Ethan didn't recognize, introduced as his brother-in-law, who had his own separate encounter with Hayes involving a road access dispute, and $40 that had never been formally documented, but was clearly documented now in handwriting that matched the urgency of the morning. 8 people in the back room of the Grant Mercantile. 6 separate sets of documents. 4 years of fear laid out across a work table in a dead man's store. Isabella looked at the room. Then she looked at Ethan. He gave her a single nod. She turned to face them. Judge Halloran is keeping Hayes occupied for the next few minutes. When he returns, he's going to review every document in this room and take formal statements from each of you. What you say today, what you sign today, goes directly to the Federal Marshal's office in Austin. This does not run through Red Creek's courthouse. It does not run through any instrument Calvin Hayes has touched. She paused. "I need to ask you something before Halloran walks through that door. I need to ask it plainly, because once this starts, it does not stop, and I will not let any of you walk into that without being certain." She looked at each face in turn. "Are you here because you're ready? Not because you're angry this morning, not because the moment feels right, but because you understand what you're committing to and you're ready to stand in it." The room was quiet. Pierce spoke first. "I'm ready." "Ready?" said Margaret Dietz. Ruth Holland said it before her husband did. Frank followed a half-second later, and his voice when it came was steadier than his face suggested it would be. Bose nodded. His brother-in-law said, "Yes, ma'am." Isabella breathed. The back door opened, and Halloran walked in, hung his coat on the hook by the door, and looked at the room. At the documents on the table. At the 8 people standing in a dead man's back room, choosing to be something other than afraid. "All right," he said, and rolled up his sleeves. "Let's build a case." Hayes sent Greer to the Mercantile at noon. Greer knocked at the front door, which was locked, and then went around to the side entrance, which was also locked, and stood there long enough that the widow Dietz kitchen girl, who had been sent to watch from across the street, ran back to report it. Isabella came out the front door alone. She walked up to Greer with the same composure she brought to everything and said, "Deputy." Greer touched his hat. He looked uncomfortable in the specific way of a young man who was beginning to understand the nature of the thing he worked for. "Sheriff Hayes is requesting that your husband come to the office. The investigation." "My husband is currently meeting with Judge Edmund Halloran," Isabella said, formerly of the 10th Circuit Court, currently acting as legal counsel in a matter of federal concern. She let that land. "If Sheriff Hayes has questions for my husband, he's welcome to direct them to Judge Halloran. I'll make sure he has the opportunity." Greer stared at her. "Federal concern," he repeated. "Federal concern," she confirmed. "Good afternoon, Deputy." She went back inside and closed the door. Greer stood on the boardwalk for a moment. Then he turned and walked back toward Hayes's office at a pace slightly faster than the one he'd arrived with. Inside, Halloran was finishing the last formal statement when Ethan's rider came back from the South Road with news that stopped the room cold. The missing cattle had been found. Not at a stranger's property. Not in an unmarked holding pen somewhere on the county's edge. At the Voss homestead. All 23 head, penned in Voss's back pasture behind a section of fence that had been recently repaired so recently that the new posts still smelled of cut wood, with a bill of sale tucked into the fence post. A bill of sale in Ethan Carter's name, dated 3 days prior, transferring ownership of 23 head of mixed cattle to Arnold Voss for the sum of $1. $1. The price used when a transfer was meant to look like concealment. Ethan read the note his rider had brought and said nothing for a moment. Isabella took the note from his hand. "Read it." Set it on the table. "That's not your signature," she said. "No," he said. "It's not." "Can you prove that?" "I can get 3 men who've seen my signature on legal documents going back 8 years. He looked at Halloran. "How bad is this?" Halloran had read this note over Isabella's shoulder. His expression was not alarmed. It was something colder and more focused than alarm. "It's not bad," he said. "It's desperate." He looked up. "This is a man who just learned something changed this morning and is trying to get ahead of it. A careful, forged document takes time to prepare. This one was ready in advance, which means he had this planned before we walked into this building today." He set the note down. "He made this before he knew we were moving, which means he doesn't yet know how far we've gotten. He'll know the moment Greer reports back," Ethan said. "Yes," Halloran said, "which means we have about 30 minutes before he stops being cautious and starts being reckless." He looked around the room. "Is there anyone here who can speak to Voss directly? Someone he trusts?" Pierce raised his hand slightly. "Voss and I share a fence line. We've had supper at each other's table." "Go," Halloran said. "Now, take Holland with you. Don't tell him what to say. Just tell him what's been found at his property and let him respond to it honestly. If Hayes put those cattle there without Voss's knowledge, that's another witness. If Voss is involved..." He paused. "Find out which it is." Pierce and Holland were out the back door before Halloran finished the sentence. They found Arnold Voss standing at his own fence, staring at 23 head of cattle that had not been there when he went to bed the night before, with the expression of a man who had just realized the floor beneath him was not where he had left it. "I don't know whose these are," he said when Pierce walked up. I woke up and they were here. I found that paper on the post, and I—" He stopped. His voice had the shaky quality of a man on the wrong side of something he didn't choose. "Pierce, I swear on my children, I don't know how they got here." Pierce looked at him for a long moment. "Hayes," he said, simply. Voss closed his eyes. "I already gave him 15 acres, he said. "What more does he want?" "He wants Ethan Carter in a cell," Holland said from behind Pierce, "and he used your land to put him there." He stepped forward. "Arnold, there are people in the Grant Mercantile right now, 6 families, a federal judge, documented evidence going back 4 years. Hayes is finished, but we need you to say what you know." Voss opened his eyes. He looked at the cattle, at the forged bill of sale still tucked in the fence post. "He sent a man last night," Voss said quietly. "Late. I heard horses, but I thought—" He pressed his mouth together. "I thought it wasn't my business. I've been telling myself things weren't my business for 2 years." "Was it Greer?" Pierce asked. "No." Voss shook his head. "The other one. Danner. The deputy who doesn't have a name on his office door." Pierce looked at Holland. Holland looked back. "Danner. Not on any official record. Not on any public roster. A man Hayes used for the things that couldn't be assigned to a named deputy." "Will you say that?" Pierce asked. "In front of Halloran. In writing." Voss looked at his fence, at the cattle that weren't his, at the bill of sale that was designed to end an innocent man's life in this county. "Yes," he said. "God help me, yes." They were back at the Mercantile in 20 minutes. Halloran listened to what Pierce and Holland reported, then turned to Isabella. "Danner," he said. "Do you know that name?" "He's not on any county payroll I can find," she said. "But my father mentions a man by that name twice in the ledger. No last name, just Danner came by. Danner handled it." "Off-book deputy," Halloran said. "Which means Hayes has been maintaining an unofficial enforcement arm. That is not a county corruption case." He looked at Ethan. "That is a criminal conspiracy charge." He picked up his pen. "I need to send a wire to Austin, now, not tomorrow now." "The Telegraph," Ethan started. "Does not go through Beale," Halloran said. "My wire goes through the federal relay at the land office in Millhaven, which Hayes has no jurisdiction over and no relationship with." He was already writing. "Get me a rider who can cover 8 miles in under an hour." Ethan had one saddled and moving within 10 minutes. The arrest came at 3 in the afternoon. Not Ethan's arrest. Hayes had sent Greer and Danner, both arriving at the Mercantile, with the formal cattle theft charge already written out, Hayes's signature on the bottom, the forged bill of sale cited as primary evidence. Greer knocked. Ethan opened the door. "Ethan Carter," Greer said. His voice had no conviction in it. "I have a warrant for your arrest on charges of cattle theft and fraudulent transfer of—" "I'd like to see that warrant," Halloran said from directly behind Ethan. Greer looked up. The color left his face in a way that was almost audible. Halloran took the warrant from Greer's hand without asking, read it, turned it over, read the back. Then he held it up and said, "This warrant references a bill of sale signed by Ethan Carter. That bill of sale was placed on the Voss property last night by a man named Danner in the presence of Arnold Voss, who is currently providing a signed statement to that effect inside this building." He lowered the paper. "This warrant is fraudulent. Executing it constitutes an act of criminal conspiracy. I would encourage you, Deputy Greer, to think very carefully about what you do in the next 10 seconds. The street had gone quiet. Ethan realized people had stopped. Not many, 6, 7, but they were standing on the boardwalk across the street, and they were watching, and they were not looking away. Greer looked at Danner. Danner was watching Halloran with the expression of a man recalculating a situation that had not gone the way the morning briefing suggested it would. "Deputy Greer," Halloran said quietly, "I'm going to ask you a question, and I want you to answer it honestly, because your honest answer right now is worth considerably more to your future than the answer Calvin Hayes would prefer you give." He paused. Did you personally witness Ethan Carter move those cattle? A long silence. No, sir, Greer said. I did not. Did anyone describe to you firsthand any witness to that effect? Another silence, smaller this time. No, sir. Then I suggest... Halloran said that you return to your office and inform Sheriff Hayes that the warrant cannot be executed in good conscience. And I further suggest that you do it quickly because the Federal Marshal's office in Austin received a communication from me approximately 40 minutes ago, and men who cooperate early tend to find their situations considerably more manageable than men who cooperate late. Greer took the warrant back from Halloran's hand, looked at it, looked at Danner. Danner turned and walked away down the boardwalk without a word. The particular walk of a man who had just decided that a given situation was no longer worth his presence. Greer looked at Ethan. Something passed across his face, not quite an apology, not quite anything that had a name. Then he folded the warrant, put it in his pocket, and turned and walked back toward Hayes's office alone. The people on the boardwalk watched him go. No one moved. No one spoke. And then Pierce stepped off the boardwalk and crossed the street and stood beside Ethan in front of the Mercantile. He did not say anything. He simply stood there. Margaret Dietz came out the front door and stood on the step. Ruth Holland came to stand beside her husband. Harlan Bowes moved to the edge of the boardwalk. One by one, the people of Red Creek who had been afraid arranged themselves in front of the building that had belonged to a frightened man who had kept records in secret and died alone in a back room, and they stood in the open in the afternoon light in full view of the office at the end of the street. Calvin Hayes appeared in his doorway. He looked at the people standing in front of the Grant Mercantile. He looked at Halloran. He looked at Ethan Carter, who looked back at him without expression, without defiance, without anything that could be taken from him or used against him. Just a man standing on his own ground. Hayes stepped back inside. The door closed. He did not come out again. Hayes did not come out of his office that afternoon, or that evening. The lamp behind his window burned through the night the way it always had, patient, certain the light of a man who believed his position was permanent. But something had shifted in the quality of that light, the way a sound changes when the room it fills becomes empty. It was the same lamp, the same window. But Red Creek was no longer the same town that had looked at it with fear for 4 years, and Hayes alone behind that glass was the last person in the county who had not yet accepted that fact. Ethan stayed at the Mercantile until well past dark. Halloran worked by lamplight at the work table, organizing statements, cross-referencing dates, building the kind of documented case that federal men needed before they would ride out of Austin and into a county dispute. He worked with the methodical patience of a man who understood that justice, when it finally arrived on paper first. Isabella made coffee and brought it without being asked, and sat across from Halloran and answered every question he put to her with the same flat precision she had used the first morning at Ethan's kitchen table. Dates, names, amounts. The shorthand her father had taught her translated line by line into language a federal court could read. At some point, Ethan pulled a chair up beside her and stayed there. Not to contribute, Halloran had what he needed from Ethan. He stayed because the room felt like it required witness, and because Isabella had been doing hard things alone for so long that he wanted her to feel the difference of someone simply being present. She did not acknowledge it directly, but at one point, when Halloran asked her to recall the exact wording of a threat Hayes had made to her father in the spring of the previous year, she paused just briefly, and her hand moved across the table and rested against Ethan's forearm for the space of 2 seconds before pulling back. It was nothing. It was everything. He understood both of those things simultaneously and said nothing about either. Yet, the federal marshal arrived on Friday. His name was Calhoun, and he came with 2 deputies and a letter from the circuit court in Austin that had enough official seals on it to make even the most stubborn county official reconsider his position. He rode directly to the Mercantile where Halloran had been expecting him, and spent the better part of 3 hours reviewing documentation that Isabella had organized with the precision of a woman who had known this moment was coming and had refused to let it arrive unprepared. Marshal Calhoun was not a man who expressed surprise easily, but midway through the ledger, the original, not the copy her father's cramped shorthand finally translated into clean English, in the margin. He stopped reading and looked up. "How long did it take him to compile this?" he asked Isabella. 3 years, she said. He wrote it in the back room after closing most nights by himself. She kept her voice even. He was afraid the whole time. He wrote it anyway. Calhoun looked at the ledger for a moment. Then he closed it carefully, the way a person closes something that deserves respect. "Your father was a brave man, Mrs. Carter." "He was a frightened man," she said. "Who did something brave? I think that's different, and I think the difference matters." Calhoun considered that. "You're right," he said. "It does." He picked up the documentation and looked at Halloran. "I'll want the original statements from Pierce Dietz, Voss Holland, and Bose before I approach the sheriff's office. I want everything on record before he has the opportunity to dispute the process." "They're ready," Halloran said. "All 5, signed and witnessed. And the forged bill of sale, documented with Voss's testimony regarding the delivery and the identity of the man who brought it." Halloran handed Calhoun a separate folder. "Danner. No official record in the county employment rolls, but Margaret Dietz identified him by description as the same man who delivered the fire inspection notice to her boarding house 18 months ago, the notice that doesn't appear in any official inspection log." Calhoun opened the folder, read, closed it. "Where is Danner now?" "Gone," Ethan said from the doorway. Left the same afternoon Greer brought the warrant. His room at the boarding house was cleared out by nightfall. "He'll surface," Calhoun said. It was not a question. "Men like that always do." He picked up his hat. "I'm going to pay Sheriff Hayes a visit. Judge Halloran, I'd appreciate your presence. Mrs. Carter." He paused. "You should be there too. You've earned the right to witness this." Isabella stood without hesitation. Ethan fell into step beside her, and neither of them discussed whether he would come. It was simply understood. Hayes answered his office door on the second knock. He had clearly not slept. His shirt was fresh, he had made that concession to appearances, but his eyes had the look of a man who had spent the night running through scenarios and finding the exits blocked in each one. He looked at Marshal Calhoun, at the federal seal on the document Calhoun held, at Halloran, at Ethan, last and longest at Isabella. Something moved across his face when he looked at her. Not remorse. Not quite. Something colder and more honest than remorse, the recognition of a man who had underestimated the wrong person and was now standing in the proof of that mistake. "Marshal," he said. His voice was professionally neutral. The voice of a man performing composure for an audience he knew wasn't buying it. "Sheriff Hayes," Calhoun said, "I have a federal warrant for your arrest on charges of extortion, land fraud, abuse of official office, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. I also have documentation sufficient to warrant a full audit of every property transaction, permit action, and legal proceeding you have been party to in your tenure as sheriff of this county." He held out the warrant. "I'd ask you to come quietly. Not because I doubt my ability to manage the alternative, but because this town has had enough noise." Hayes looked at the warrant for a long moment without taking it. "Who filed this?" he asked, though he knew. 6 families, Calhoun said, with documentation going back 4 years. "These are people with grievances," Hayes said, "with axes to grind. You can't build a federal case on the complaints of people who—" "The bill of sale is forged," Halloran said. "Quiet. Absolute. We have the testimony of the man on whose property it was placed, identifying the individual who placed it at your direction. We have the original survey records your office claimed were damaged, recovered from a separate county archive. We have 4 years of payment records in the handwriting of a man who is dead, a man who died afraid in a back room because you made certain that fear had no exit." He took 1 step forward. "Don't talk to me about grievances, Calvin. I've sat on that bench long enough to know the difference between a grievance and the truth." Hayes was quiet. Then he reached out and took the warrant from Calhoun's hand. Looked at it, folded it once, put it in his breast pocket with the same practiced gesture he had used for every official document in 4 years of office. "I'll want my lawyer," he said. "You'll have him," Calhoun said. "In Austin." They took Hayes out the front door of his office and onto the main street of Red Creek at 10:30 in the morning. The street was not empty. Ethan did not know when people had started gathering, whether word had traveled the night before, or whether some instinct had pulled them out of their houses and shops that morning, the way animals sense a change in weather before the clouds arrive. But they were there. Not a crowd exactly. Just people. The Hollands. The Dietz woman with her kitchen girl. Harlan Bowes and his brother-in-law. Thomas Aldridge, old and slow, standing in front of the feed store with his hat against his chest. Men and women he recognized, and men and women he didn't. Lining both sides of the street in the way people line a route when they need to see something pass and be certain it's real. Nobody cheered. That wasn't what this was. They just stood and watched Calvin Hayes walk between Calhoun's deputies to the horse that would take him out of Red Creek, and the watching itself was the thing the public witnessed, unafraid watching of a county that had been frightened for 4 years, and was choosing in this moment to be done with it. Hayes did not look at the street. He kept his eyes forward and his back straight and performed dignity for an audience that had stopped owing him anything. At the edge of the gathering, Isabella stood beside Ethan. She watched Hayes pass without expression, without triumph, without any of the visible satisfaction that the moment might have justified. Ethan watched her watching him, and understood something about her that he hadn't had words for until now, that for Isabella Grant, this had never been about winning. It had been about stopping something. Those were different motivations, and they produced different faces, and hers was simply the face of a woman watching a harm end. When Hayes was passed and the deputies were moving toward the South Road, she let out a breath. A long, slow, controlled breath that she had probably been holding in various forms since the night her father died. "It's done," Ethan said. "The arrest is done," she said. "The rest takes time." "It does," he agreed. "But the rest isn't on you alone." She turned and looked at him. Really looked the same way he had looked at her that first morning at the fence past the surface of things down into what was actually there. "No," she said quietly. "It isn't." The weeks that followed were not simple. They were not the clean resolution that people in trouble sometimes imagine waits for them on the other side of the worst moment. They were complicated and slow, and full of the ordinary difficulty of rebuilding things that had been damaged over years. The county audit took 3 months. Every property transaction Hayes had touched was reviewed, and the results were worse in some places and better in others than anyone had predicted. Pierce got his water rights restored in full. The Hollands deed was corrected by a state surveyor who confirmed the original discrepancy had been introduced not found. Voss recovered 12 of his 15 acres. The other 3 were tangled in a separate filing that would require another year to resolve, and he accepted that with the patience of a man who understood that partial justice moving forward was still justice. Margaret Dietz received a formal reimbursement letter from the county for the fraudulent inspection fee. She framed it and hung it in the boarding house hallway, not out of pride, but as a reminder for her guests, for herself, that the paper record of a wrong kept carefully could eventually become the paper record of a correction. Robert Grant's ledger was entered into federal evidence and returned to Isabella afterward because Calhoun understood without being asked that it was not just documentation. It was a man's life work in a second form, and it belonged to his daughter. She kept it on the shelf in the Mercantile's back room beside the new operating license that bore 2 names. Ethan's cattle came home on a Thursday, 2 weeks after the arrest, driven back to the east pasture by a county deputy, a new one appointed by a temporary administrator, while the sheriff's office was under federal review, who delivered them with a written apology from the county clerk and a handshake that was more uncomfortable for the deputy than it was for Ethan. Ethan counted them at the gate out of habit. 23, all present, all fine. He stood at the fence for a moment after the deputy rode away and felt something settle in his chest that he recognized after a beat as the specific relief of a man who has been braced for a long time and has finally been given permission to stop. He had not realized until this moment how long he had been braced. Isabella was at the store most days. The Mercantile had stayed open through everything because closing it would have been a concession she refused to make, and because the people of Red Creek had started coming in with a different energy than before, the particular tentative warmth of a community, relearning what it felt like to move through a shared space without fear underneath everything. She managed the book's renegotiated 3 supplier contracts at better rates than her father had ever managed, and hired a young woman named Clara to help with the front counter on busy days. Ethan wrote in most evenings. They had fallen into a rhythm without discussing it. Dinner at the table in the back room, the day's business reviewed the next day's problems identified and assigned. Practical. Organized. The machinery of a real partnership running the way real partnerships run, on attention and honesty and the willingness to say the difficult thing before it became a larger difficult thing. It was not romantic in the way that word usually gets used. It was something better than that. It was reliable. It was the kind of thing you could build on. Utsu. 6 weeks after the arrest, on a quiet Tuesday evening when the store was closed and the street was empty and the back room held only the 2 of them and the lamp and the account books, Isabella looked up from a column of figures and said without preamble, "I want to ask you something and I need you to answer it honestly." "All right," he said. "That first morning, at the fence." She set her pen down. "You said you agreed because you were tired of giving men like Hayes what they counted on." She looked at him steadily. "Was that the only reason?" He was quiet for a moment. Not evasive thinking. The way he did everything with the deliberate care of a man who had decided early that words mattered and should be used accurately. "No," he said. "What was the other reason?" He looked at the table. At the glass jar, the small plain jar from that first morning, which now sat on the shelf in the back room of the Mercantile between 2 volumes of account records, occupying the space of something kept on purpose. "You rode out in the dark," he said, "before sunrise. Your father was not yet in the ground. You had every reason to fall apart, and instead you saddled your horse and rode to a stranger's gate and asked for what you needed." He looked at her. "I had been alone for 11 years and told myself it was a choice. That morning, I understood it wasn't. It was just the absence of a reason good enough to stop." He paused. "You were a good enough reason." The lamp moved slightly in a draft from somewhere. Isabella did not look away, did not perform composure or suppress the thing that moved across her face. She let it be there, the fullness of it, the weight of it, the fact that someone had seen her clearly and not looked away. "I came to you because you were solvent and uncorrupted," she said. "That's what I told myself." "I know. I think I also came to you," she said slowly, "because when I went through the list of every man in this county, you were the only one I could imagine telling the truth to." She picked up her pen, set it down again. "I didn't understand that about myself until later." He reached across the table and moved the account book gently out of the space between them. "Isabella," he said. The first time he had used her given name. She had used his weeks ago. He had been saving his without knowing he was saving it. She looked at him. "We built something real," he said. "Not what either of us planned, but real." He held her gaze. "I'd like to keep building it." She was quiet for a long moment. The kind of quiet that was not empty, but full of everything a person weighs when they have been self-sufficient long enough that trust feels like a risk and hope feels like exposure. Then she said, "So would I." Outside, Red Creek was quiet in the particular way of a town that had recently remembered what quiet was supposed to feel like. Not the quiet of suppression of fear, keeping mouths shut and eyes down. The quiet of ordinary life, resuming, of people going to sleep without calculating what tomorrow's threat would cost them, of a main street that belonged to the people who walked it and not to the man at the end of it. The lamp in the old sheriff's office was dark for the first time in 4 years. Pierce was home with his family and his water rights intact. The Hollands were eating supper on a deed that finally told the truth about the land beneath their feet. Margaret Dietz had a new sign above her boarding house door, paid for with the reimbursement money, because she said it was only right that Hayes's extortion bought something that would outlast him. Arnold Voss was teaching his oldest son to mend fence on land that was still against the odds, and by the grace of people who had finally stopped being silent his. And Robert Grant's ledger sat on a shelf in the back room of his store beside the account books of the business that bore his name and would keep bearing it in the hands of a woman who had learned courage from his fear, who had taken everything he had been too afraid to use and turned it into something that could not be undone. In the back room, Ethan Carter and Isabella Grant Carter, now by law and by choice, by strategy, that had become something neither of them had the strategy to predict, sat across from each other in the lamplight, with the account books pushed aside and no particular business left to conduct, and stayed there anyway. Because the silence between two people who have chosen each other honestly is not the silence of loneliness. It is the sound of something finally irrevocably whole. And in Red Creek, Texas, on a quiet Tuesday evening at the end of a long and necessary season of truth, that was exactly what it was.